Hello everyone and welcome. I am Yağmur Civan Uyanık and I am the Administrative Assistant at Koç University's Research Center for Anatolian Civilizations. Thank you for joining us for our monthly webinar meeting for this month's talk titled In Church and at Home, Byzantine Prior Books, Ecologia as Sources for Daily Life and Social History. We are hosting Elizabeth Schiffer, former ANAMED Fellow İlyas Neseris, Daniel Galatza, and Irene Afentoulidou. The talk will be moderated by Claudia Rapp, who is a professor of Byzantine Studies at the University of Vienna and interim director of the Institute for Medieval Research at the Austrian Academy of Sciences. She is a member of several academies, advisory boards, e.g. Senior Fellow of Dumbarton Oaks and editorial boards, Journal of Byzantine Studies, Jahrbuch der österreichischen Byzantinistik. In 2015, she received the Wittgenstein Award, Austria's highest academic recognition. In the same year, together with a team of scholars, she initiated the Vienna Ecologia project. And this evening, Professor Rapp and the scientific team of the project will talk about their ongoing prior book project. A Q&A session will follow the talk. You are more than welcome to write your questions into the Q&A button throughout the event. I also would like to inform you that the microphones and videos of all attendees are turned off automatically and that this event is being recorded. Now, I am leaving the microphone to our moderator, Professor Rapp, to introduce our speakers and start the conversation. Have a wonderful talk.
Thank you very much. We are very grateful to ANAMED and all its staff in front and behind the scenes for giving us this opportunity to share our ongoing research that we have been working on as a joint team. I will share my screen now so that you can get the screen. We will later on be able to show our faces again during the Q&A. So what we are trying to do in our joint research is to get a better idea of the way in which people lived. If you like, it's an attempt at doing history from below, trying to peep through the keyhole into the private lives, into the homes and the village life of the people who populated Byzantium. After all, 80 to 90% of the population in the Byzantine Empire worked in agriculture and in the countryside, but they're not usually talked about in the written sources, in the historiographies that we read. We can sometimes get a glimpse of their lives from hagiography, but it really takes, we're really eager to explore other kinds of sources to get to the lives they lived and especially to the concerns that occupied them in their daily lives from birth to the grave. And this is what the Ephyologia can do for us to some extent. And here is how we are presenting our talk today. I will give a brief introduction into what the Ephyologia are. Then Dr. Elizabeth Schiffer, who is working at the Austrian Academy of Sciences, will present the Ephyologion on Byzantium, followed by Dr. Elias Neseris, who is a project affiliate after working with us since 2015, will present the manuscript research on Byzantine Ephyologia. After that, we will have the opportunity for question and answers and discussion. And in the second part of our presentation, Dr. Irene Afentoulidou, who is also at the Austrian Academy of Sciences, will present her research on prayers on birth and childbed. And Professor Dr. Daniel Galatza of the Pontifical Institute of Oriental Studies in Rome will present from his work on the prayers for the dead in Byzantine Ephyologia. And after that, we'll have more opportunities for question and answers and discussions. We will keep our presentations brief. We've calculated 8 minutes each, and we hope we will be able to keep it at that, so to have a lively interaction with you, the audience. So please feel free to write in the chat already now. We will be able to see your questions later during the Q&A, which I'll moderate. So what is the Archeologia? This is the source that we are using. As you can see from this image, there are many examples of Archeologia in any given library. Here you see the 80 Greek Archeologia that contain one particular ritual, and a selection of them on this table at the monastery of St. Catherine's in the Sinai. They're small in size, they're not very precious, as you can tell. And that is the reason why most scholars have neglected them. They are not beautiful manuscripts that are illuminated. They contain liturgical texts that are well known, especially the Eucharistic liturgies of John Chrysostom of Basil the Great. They contain sacramental liturgies for baptism, entry into the monastic state, wedding and funeral, as well as others. And they contain blessings and prayers like the water blessing or prayers for confession. They're made for the use of priests, so don't confuse them with prayer books used for private devotion as we know them from the medieval West. They were used by the priest in different liturgical contexts. That's why we were saying in church and at home. They could also be used in other settings under the open sky, for example. That explains in part why they are of small format, because they could be portable and the priest needs to be able to hold the book in his left hand while with the right hand he makes liturgical gestures. What is of particular interest to us are the occasional prayers. In German, we call them Anlassgebete, prayers for a specific occasion, or Anlass in German, that address various occasions in the life of a person or of a village community. Birth, that we'll hear about from Irene Afentolido, prayers concerning the process of dying, that we'll hear about from Daniel Galazza, but also in between the hair clipping of a child, for example, the offering of the first beard of a young man, the binding up of hair when a woman enters adulthood, and also prayers, for example, for ritual brother making, are there for pieces, which is how I became first interested in this very rich material. In addition, these prayers also accompany concerns in village communities. They're largely agricultural in outlook. So, for example, prayers for drought, prayers after an earthquake, prayers when something has fallen into a well, prayers for the repairing of fish nets, for the inauguration of beehives, prayers when churches have been used by heretics and need to be purified again, and very interesting prayers for the sowing of seed at the beginning of the agricultural season or for grape harvest. So there's a huge variety of prayers in these manuscripts, and not every manuscript has the same kinds of prayers. There's huge regional variation. And all of this needs to be understood and systematized. The oldest, so we need to work with the manuscripts, and they are our archaeological material, if you like, the basis on which we are working. Some of them are published and edited, others are not. And we estimate that there's about 2,000 manuscripts in total that need to be considered. The manuscript transmission begins in the late 8th century with the manuscript that you see on the left. It's now in the Vatican Library, Barbarinianus Graecus 336. It was copied in majuscule letters in the late 8th century in southern Italy, and shows signs of its later use in the Latin-speaking regions and Greek praying regions of southern Italy. We end our consideration, our research, in around 1650, because then the printed editions of the Ephyologion begin. The most famous and the most accessible is Jacques Goard's edition, made in Paris, first edition 1647. That is also available on Google Books. But prayer books continued to be copied well into the 19th century, even after printing became popular and common. Here you see our website, and we invite you to visit the website. You can find our publications there. You can find our working methods and our toolbox there, and more information on how we do our work. On this picture, you also see Dr. Giulia Rossetto, who is joining us not as a speaker, but as a listener today, and whom you can't see is Dr. Renate Burri, who is also here as a listener and has joined the project this summer. The aims of our project, which is supported by the Austrian National Research Fund, the FWF, is twofold. First, we need to establish a census, a listing of all Ephyologian manuscripts until the year 1650. And that task is slowly progressing. We're working on the basis of printed catalogs, but also wherever we can include library visits to verify and expand on what we know from the printed manuscript catalogs. And we want to ultimately establish a database of prayers where you could look for prayer concerns and be guided to the manuscripts that contain the relevant prayers. In addition, we work on thematic studies of prayers and their manuscript contexts. Daniel Galazza on the history of scholarship on liturgical manuscripts, Renate Burri on manuscripts and the contexts of their use, Giulia Rossetto in a separately funded project on Ephyologia and the Sinai. Elias Nesseris has been working and publishing on the context of education and literary production and the use of prayers. Elisabeth Schiffer, whom you'll hear in a moment, on prayers and the political history or prayers by known authors. Irini Afentoulidou, again in a separately funded and affiliated project on prayer concerns and the history of women and gender, and you will hear from her as well. My own interest relates to prayer concerns and social history, expanding on my earlier work on Byzantine brother making. I'm now interested in organized lay piety. So this is an invitation to say, watch this space for updates. This is ongoing research, and we look forward in the time that we have together to take you into these different areas of study. As you can see from this slide, the prayer books were used by the priest in a variety of different contexts. On the top left, you have an illustration from the 12th century chronicle of John Skylitzes, where ritual brotherhood is concluded. You can see, I hope you can see my arrow. You can see the priest under the baldachin on the right-hand scene, where he is extending his hand in blessing over two men clad in red and blue. This is the future Emperor Basil I and John, the son of the wealthy widow Danelis, whom you see standing in the background to the left. They're being joined as spiritual brothers through this ritual of brother making. And while they are swearing on a gospel book that is lying on a little book stand in front of them, the priest in his left hand actually holds what we must assume is the prayer book. In the top right-hand photograph, you see the priest in the altar space using the Ephyologion and other liturgical books as he's pronouncing the Eucharistic liturgy. On the bottom left, you see the priest with the white stole as he is reading from a book that is held in front of him by the man dressed in black, probably a priest or a deacon. And this is an example of the use of the Ephyologion outside the house and outside indeed of a church building, right at the site where these prayers are being needed. This is a prayer for the blessing of salt harvesting that was recently created, formulated on the basis of older prayer texts for this particular purpose. And then the bottom right, we're going outside the Orthodox tradition of the Greek Orthodoxy. We're going to the Armenian church, where you see young people lined up receiving prayers said by the priest. If you look very closely, he's standing barely visible in front of the altar. And he is holding a book in his hand, saying prayers for these young people as they're preparing for the university entrance exams. I'm showing you these images because they illustrate the whole range for which prayers can be said and the Ephyologia manuscripts can be used. And this is, I think, enough for an introduction, and I now hand over to Elisabeth Schiffer, who will speak about the Ephyologion in Byzantium. Elisabeth, I am not able to read your paper while operating the slides, so you'll have to tell me when the new slides are on.
Yes, I will do so. Thank you. So, given the necessary brevity of time for my contribution, the title, The Ephyologion in Byzantium, is perhaps too promising. I would, however, like to give you a brief overview of where we come across these manuscripts in the Byzantine written sources. These sources may be narrative texts, for example, descriptions of saint lives, or also prescriptive or descriptive texts that circulated in Byzantine periods. For example, texts about imperial ceremonies or court ceremonies in general. No Ephyologion manuscript has come down to us that dates before the end of the 8th century. The earliest witness is the already mentioned Ephyologion Barbadini Greek 336 in the Vatican Library. Ephyological textual material can actually be traced in texts that predate the Ephyologion Barbadini. For the occasion today, I will limit my remarks to the following: to the definition of the Ephyologion as a liturgical book, to mentions of the Ephyologion and references to the Ephyologion in Byzantine texts, and to prayers that are connected with events or persons with a historical context. The Ephyologion is the liturgical book that contains the presidential prayers for the Eucharist, for the sacraments, and for blessings or consecrations of persons, objects, and things reserved to the bishop or the priest, as Elena Velkovska has characterized the Ephyologion. If we ask for a Byzantine definition of the Ephyologion, it is advisable to look it up in the Suda, the 10th century Byzantine encyclopedia, where we read the rather simple explanation that an Ephyologion is the small book, Biblidion in Greek. Here you see, once again on the left, the only known depiction of such a codex in the left hand of a priest who performs the ritual of brother making. On the right, you see the cover of one of the most recent studies on the Ephyologion, showing a similar hand posture of the priest who is holding an Ephyologion. During the process of compiling and writing an Ephyologion, a selection of prayers had to be made, and as a rule, there are no two identical Ephyologia. What is of interest to us are the criteria for the selection of prayers. Even if we assume a certain degree of long-lastingness or traditional consciousness of the compilers and scribes, we can expect that mostly those prayers were copied for which there was a need in the specific context of each manuscript. And this brings us to the approach we are pursuing with our project, in which we also ask for the relevance of the prayers within the community in which they were used. Now the next slide, please. The Lexikon zur Byzantinischen Gräzität, a dictionary of medieval Greek with a focus on learned literature, not only provides us with a German literal translation as prayer collection, Gebetssammlung, and points to its character as a liturgical book, but also lists some evidence for the word Eschologion in Byzantine text. Among these sources are a Typikon, which is a regulation of a monastery, the Typikon of Gregorius Pakurianos, as well as a donor will, the testament of Eustathius Voilas. These are rare cases of explicit mentions of Eschologia. Only a reference to such a liturgical book is given in a hagiographical text from the 6th or 7th century, the Vita of Nikolaus Ioannidis. Nikolaus' holiness had revealed itself early, and after his ordination to the rank of a reader in the church, the young Nikolaus went to see his uncle, who supported his nephew in his desire for a holy life. On this occasion, the uncle gave him a book as a gift, called A Book Which Contained the Divine Liturgy and the Other Prayers that he might learn by heart, unquote. So the young Nikolaus, who had embarked on the path to the priesthood, received the liturgical book with the Divine Liturgy and other undefined prayers, and he was supposed to learn both by heart. It was probably self-evident to the audience of this text which prayers these so-called other prayers were, and we will not be mistaken in calling the book that was given to Nikolaus an Eschologion. After this Byzantine narrative text that refers to a monastic way of life, I will now turn to some prayers that reveal a somehow historical context. Next slide, please. Here you see a list of some occasions that were either commemorated on a fixed date, such as May 11, as the day of Constantinople's inauguration in the year 330, or events that can be placed in a historical context. This list should not yet be considered complete. It is work in progress. So Eschologia, and I should add here especially those that represent the Constantinopolitan liturgical tradition, may also include prayers for the liturgical celebrations that relate to the imperial family, like marriage or baptism, or prayers for ceremonies in which the emperor participates together with the patriarch. We know that emperor and patriarch met regularly, for example, on the first day of the week after Easter, or in August for the feast of the imperial grape harvest. There is also a prayer that could be said at any time when the patriarch meets the emperor, as the title says. We know of such visits from the texts like the Book of Ceremonies by the Emperor Constantine Progenitus, or the so-called Pseudokodinos that presents a later stage of court ceremony. It is in these texts where we can learn from the non-liturgical texts about the setting of the prayer text. This is valuable information because most of the prayers in the Eschologia are presented without an explanatory note. Further, we know of a ceremony at the departure of the imperial fleet which could take place with or without the presence of the patriarch. We find, for example, prayers for the occasion of conversion and prayers for the readmission of apostates. They reveal a certain historical context, since the change of religious affiliation can be caused by changing political situations. Of course, there's also the possibility for voluntary change of religious affiliation. Our sources differ explicitly between apostates who were forced to change their religious affiliation and those who choose to do so by themselves. The prayers on the occasion of the reopening of the church originate in a similar context. These ceremonies were held, for example, when a church had been used by Christians following the Latin Rite. Among the most frequently transmitted prayers in the Eschologia are prayers for laying the foundation stone of the church. And on the next slide,
Excuse me. Apologies.
yes, thank you. So to the fixed date of May 11 that I've already mentioned, other dates can be added, like September the 1st, the beginning of the new year. Other fixed dates are the commemoration of earthquakes that struck the area of Constantinople on September 25 in the year 437 and on October 26 in the year 740, as well as the commemoration of an attempt on the life of Emperor Heraclius on June the 5th in 623. The collection of dates, which I'm showing here, is based on a very special epholorion that is kept at the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris. It is the so-called Strategios epholorion, with the shelf mark Collin 213. Strategios, who is mentioned in the title and in a note at the end of the manuscript, is otherwise unknown. The manuscript is dated to the year 1027. The note at the end of the manuscript also reveals that this epholorion was in use in the oratories at the Great Church in Constantinople. And you see here on the next slide, please. Yes, thank you. The beginning of the prayers for the processions that were regularly held to commemorate the earthquakes and the attempt on Heraclius that I mentioned earlier. It's above. So I hope that I have been able to give you some insights into the epholoria, into our work with these manuscripts, as well as into the texts they transmit. These liturgical texts are also important for historical and social historical questions, and we will now hear more from my colleagues.
Thank you very much, Elisabeth Schiffer. And now we're getting ready to hear Dr. Elias Nesseris. Elias?
Sorry, but he is not here right now. Maybe
Oh dear.
there's a problem of his network.
Okay.
We are trying to communicate with him.
Uh-huh. Maybe this is the moment where I stop sharing and we see if there's any questions that have come in already at this moment. No open questions. Elias, welcome back. Elias, can you hear us? We cannot hear you yet.
Yes, I can hear you. I'm sorry, there was a blackout for a second, so my router,
Yes, you said there was bad weather where you are. I'm going
can you hear me now?
to share the screen again.
Mhm.
Okay. There we are.
So thank you, and I'm sorry again for this interruption. So in his introduction to medieval Latin paleography, the expert, the pioneer in the field, the late Leonard Bowie, pointed out to the fact, and I quote here, that the text does not float in the air, but it solidly stands on two supports, one physical and the other textual. The same principles apply, of course, also to all sorts of texts written in the Greek East during the same time, secular, theological, and liturgical alike. What sets the latter, the liturgical, among other things, distinctly apart from the former, is a certain degree of fluidity up to a certain point, which is not so apparent in other categories. While, for example, the text of Homer, Aristotle, or the three major tragedians was established rather early on and was transmitted with its minute variants and layers upon layers of scholia in a standardized manner. This seems not to have been the case of the occasional prayers that we find in the numerous ephologia that have come down to us from the Byzantine and post-Byzantine periods. This can certainly be attributed to a degree of orality involved in the process of the creation of such a book, and understandably so, since ephologia were manuscripts created for the needs of priests. There are literally dozens of such occasions registered when an ephologion was commissioned by a clergyman, be that a deacon, a priest, or a bishop, and the copyist would most often than not be another priest or a monk. This means that there are plenty of occasions where a priest copying a prayer he knew by heart and one that he recited day in and day out, he would not perhaps need to have a close look at his master copy, the so-called antivolon. So this is how many variants in the text of our prayers sneak into the text. Moreover, as these manuscripts served practical needs in the daily life of the community the priest was a part of, it makes sense that over the course of time, the owner and the main user of the Ephologien would make new additions and enrich his material as he saw fit, perhaps even using different exemplars or even different copying prayer texts that came from different liturgical traditions. This is why we come across so many duplications of prayers in various manuscripts. So for instance, a prayer on the same concern can be found in one place in the manuscript, and then it can be repeated in another place. And this is not to speak about dialectical and grammatical or other peculiarities in the text of many occasional prayers, depending on the level of the education the scribe possessed, his place of origin, and such other factors. In the Vienna Ephologия project, as we are navigating through this very rich, and I have to say rewarding material, I have developed a number of tools so as to facilitate our research. One such tool is the matrix of dated Ephologия manuscripts with known scribes. This kind of information is pretty often given in the colophon of the manuscript, and you can see one such example in the second slide. This could be a short text written by the copyist, most usually at the end of the book, or a codicological unit, where he specifies where, when, by whom, and sometimes for whom the Ephologien was copied. So in the slide here, you can see the colophon of Codex Vaticanus Ottobonianus Graecus 344, an Ephologien written by Galaction, the presbyter and second cantor of the metropolis of Otranto. So we are in the Greek-speaking part of southern Italy, on January 29th of the year 1177. We have opted to enter the data into an Excel file, simply because it will be easier that way to transfer the data to a database later on. The first tab of the document will contain all the entries that have to do with the paleographical and codicological features of the manuscripts, since the materiality of these books is a dimension upon which we place a lot of weight. In the third slide, you can see some of the columns that have to do with the manuscript's codicological features. For example, writing support, whether it was written on paper or parchment, its binding, its exterior dimensions or the ruling type, and also its paleographical features. For instance, you can see in the second snippet in column AF, which is devoted to the type of script the scribe used. In this case, we have the type of the so-called minuscula barocca that was pretty commonly used for southern Italian manuscripts. Other columns are devoted to the book's later history, which can be manifested through its movement in time from one place to another, and from one possessor to the next, and of course the later marginal notes that can so often be found in manuscripts. This is, in other words, the method that our colleague in Vienna, Dr. Christian Gastgeber, has dubbed prosopographical paleography. This kind of information can be very helpful for us in order to realize if the prayers in the manuscript continue to be in use in one or the other community with the passing of time, or whether their existence in the manuscript could perhaps be explained on the basis of the Ephologion's prescriptive nature, which means that perhaps a later owner of the manuscript would just like to have a collection of all the prayers he could have access to, whether they would still be in use or not. To this end, also the recording of the signs of use of a manuscript, you can see here, for example, column AR, can be of paramount importance, since next to many akoluthia that continue to be in use over the course of centuries, we usually find wax drops and other such signs, while other parts of the manuscript bear less or even no such marks at all. In the second tab, and you can see how it looks in the fourth slide, we are giving the contents of the manuscript as extensively as it is possible. We have employed color coding for similar groups of contents. For instance, yellow here signifies occasional prayers, while blue is assigned to the Eucharistic liturgies and so on, because it's very interesting to explore why and how the grouping of the material took place, perhaps by establishing a pattern in the dated Ephología by known scribes. We'll be able to discern in the future, once the matrix is completed, connections across space and time and the intersection perhaps of liturgical traditions. Finally, we have established a list of dated manuscripts to be entered in the matrix, as you can see in slide number 5, which contains so far 130 manuscripts. Perhaps the number will rise in the future as our research continues, and we come across more manuscripts that are being digitized in the moment. We have also created a README file with a very detailed set of instructions as to how the entries in the matrix are to be made. Any comments would be welcome. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much to Elisabeth Schiffer and Elias Nesseris for their presentations. I see that there is at least one question in the... No, we don't have any questions so far. But you are welcome to ask questions, of course. We'd be happy to hear from you. Maybe we could talk a bit more, Elias and others, about the traces of use. You mentioned the wax drops. Do you want to talk more about what other traces of use could there be?
Yeah, for instance, we have a lot of signs that have to do with the thumping of the pages. So as the priest or other users, live through the manuscript, this could leave traces on the manuscript. So we're able to locate which parts were mostly used, or more than others anyway. But in the course of our travels with the project, we have been able to locate some interesting examples. For instance, in Patmos, in one of the manuscripts, just in the middle of the marriage akoluthia, where the common cup prayer is recited, we have been able to locate traces of spilt wine, for example. Or in other manuscripts, perhaps in the place where the hair clipping prayer was recorded, I think sometimes we find, traces of hair clippings or something like that.
Thank you. I am looking at the questions, so I'm going to answer. I'm going to read the question of Elisa Gallardi. Thank you for presenting this very rich and promising material. I will closely follow the progress of your work. What is the geographical breadth of your material? You mentioned that there is regional variety. Do you already have an idea of which areas of the Byzantine Empire are represented in the Ephyologia? Thank you. Who would like to answer that question? Elias, do you want to respond? Yeah.
Yeah, so basically, I think all parts of the Byzantine Empire are represented, even those that at some point were, outside the borders of the empire. So we have manuscripts coming from the Eastern Mediterranean, Cyprus, Palestine, and Sinai, from the Greek-speaking communities of southern Italy, from other areas in the periphery of the Byzantine world, like the Pontic regions or even Epirus. Now, the interesting part is that depending on the geographical regions, sometimes manuscripts from regions that were close to one to the other bear some share some common codicological features. For instance, yellow washing was very common in southern Italian and manuscripts from Epirus. As far as the liturgical tradition is concerned, I think the liturgiologists are more, more to the task.
Yeah. So, and another additional response to your query would be to say that for the moment we focus on the Greek medieval tradition, but it would be interesting to see how this prayer tradition continues and is expanded in the post-Byzantine period and in the Orthodox regions that derive their ritual traditions from Byzantium, but then extend into the post-Byzantine times and into different languages. So Slavonic would be one place to look, for example. But that is something that we can only attempt to do once we have laid the groundwork with our current work. So I'm going to mark this question as answered and go to the next question by Anonymous. which I think the question of whether we include comparative material, that is the Slavic Ephiologia, has just been answered. This is something that we are reserving for part 2, or stage 3 rather, of our work together. So I'll mark this question as answered as well. Then the next question is, what can we say about the different types of Ephiologia? Is a typikon a subtype of Ephiologion? I'll pass that question on to Daniel Galazza, our liturgical specialist.
Yeah, so thank you. That's a good question. An Ephiologion is a book type that's classified, as we heard from Dr. Elizabeth Schiffer, as a prayer book of the presider that contains prayers based on its name. So a typikon is a different type of liturgical book, and its main purpose is actually not to be used during the services to provide text to use during liturgical services, but to regulate them, and primarily to regulate services beyond the Eucharistic liturgy or the sacraments, but rather the liturgy, what's called the liturgy of the hours, or services like Vespers or Orthros, Matins, or other services like that have that are dependent on the liturgical year. And so there could be different commemorations in the calendar that collide, and the typikon's purpose is to regulate that and to explain how to do the services generally, if we're speaking about a liturgical typikon, because there's also monastic typica, which are kind of guidebooks to daily life in a monastery, and that's another category. So they're two different book types, and Ephiologion and a typikon are not directly related in that way.
Yeah. And I mentioned the typikon because in this typikon of Gregorius Pagorianos also includes a book inventory of the books that were owned by the monastery, and therefore the Ephiologion is mentioned in this typikon in the framework of the book inventory that is included in the typikon.
Mm-hmm. Maybe this is the moment where we invite Elisabeth Schiffer to explain a bit further that the word Ephiologion in Byzantine times can result in some very different manuscripts. We have some manuscripts that call themselves an Ephiologion and others that don't. And sometimes those that call themselves an Ephiologion do not necessarily have the small prayers that we expect.
Yeah. So in narrative texts, the mention of the Ephiologion is very rare, and that in most of the manuscripts that are transmitted do not call themselves an Ephiologion. And from those, some of them have included the Eucharistic liturgies and others do not. So evidence for the use of the word Ephiologion is very rare, and therefore I started to collect all this material, and especially of interest are those texts that refer to the Ephiologion without mentioning it, like the example I mentioned in the life of Nikolaos Ioannidis.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Now there's a question for Muradia Borsale. Thanks for your presentation. Maybe you will mention it, but I want to ask you how much detail there is about daily life. For example, picking up honey, harvesting, etc. We do have prayers for many everyday occasions, like harvesting, like the sowing of seeds, like at the beginning of the spring, the prayers associated with Saint Tryphon to keep insects away from the fields. we can tell from these prayer texts, and in the second half of our presentation, you will actually see prayer texts, that these issues were of concern. What we cannot get from these prayer texts is information about what tools people used, how many people worked the fields, and what kinds of grains they were using. So it is more of a spiritual approach into people's everyday lives and concerns, but it does not actually tell us about the realia, the real types of objects that people used and were associated with in their lives and in these prayers that are being addressed. For that, we would have to look elsewhere. Let me see if there's more questions coming up. From Ahaf Brahim. Thank you very much for the presentation. Dr. Nesseris, you mentioned the main user of the Archeologion might add new material or copy prayer texts from different traditions. Could you please elaborate on that? Are there attestations of material added from outside the Byzantine tradition? Thank you.
Well, I didn't necessarily mean from outside the Byzantine tradition, because there were different trends, with liturgical trends within the Byzantine tradition, depending on the center on the center where these developments took place. For instance, there were different developments that took place in Palestine and Jerusalem, others in Constantinople. So we speak about the Constantinopolitan tradition or a Syro-Palestine tradition, and so on. But since the book was a portable object, many of the times priests or monks were itinerant, so perhaps they could visit the great monastic center of the East, take their books with them, and on occasion they would find, a prayer that they found interesting, they would copy it and use it back home. So this is more or less what I'm referring to.
Mm-hmm. But there's also, I think, and this is worth mentioning because it's something that you have discovered, Elias, a sort of overlap between prayer texts as such and texts that are used in the context of higher education. And maybe you could talk more about that.
Yeah, so there was a development in 12th century Constantinople, most probably, where prayer texts that were, the pupils knew them by heart, more or less, and they were used for the blessing of the new school year. They were used as teaching material themselves, and as the course over the course of centuries, this material, from a strictly liturgical use, it obtained an educational character. So it was used in the classroom, not for the blessing of the school year, but for the teaching of grammar, syntax, and so on. So it was a transformation.
Mm-hmm. And to me, that is totally fascinating, because for the longest time, we've always assumed that religion belongs into one sphere and higher education into another. And what we can see here is that the two blend effortlessly, one into the other. And that is something I think that we must be aware of to much greater extent than has happened in the past.
And it's important to note here that all this material has survived only in secular manuscripts, like manuals of grammar, not in Ευχολογία. So, for instance, we have painters' manuals that retain the prayer for when a person will be instructed into painting, but we don't find these kinds of prayers in Ευχολογία, only in painters' manuals, for example.
Yeah. Which then raises the question that we've been waiting for, and maybe some of you will ask it later, but we can also address it now, which is to what degree the occasional prayers that we find written down in the Ευχολογία represent an authoritative selection. And Elias Nesseris already has shown that we must assume that prayers of similar nature can be encountered in other contexts. Although, Elias, I want to be specific. The example that you've given for the prayers in the painters' manuals, are these prayers that the painters would say before they start, or are these prayers to be said by a priest?
Well, most of the times in the post-Byzantine period, the teacher was also a priest. So I'm guessing
Right.
this is how, the prayer snuck into the text in the manuals.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, I think that's a very important observation. And that confirms this blending of the religious and the secular sphere, where people who were of priestly rank, of course, were present in all sorts of other contexts of society, not just in the churches. So Mustafa Yildiz has just sent in a question. Thank you for the presentations. On Pinakes, we see many small excerpts of prayers, some surviving on just a couple of folios, categorized as ophiologium. Do you include this kind of material in the project? Elias, would you speak to that?
Well, yeah, sometimes we find prayers that are copied on the fly leaves in the beginning or at the end of the manuscript without exactly the manuscript being an euphologium. It could be a typicon, it could be whatever, even a secular manuscript. But yeah, we take these prayers into account, especially for the establishment of the database of prayers.
The difficulty, of course, is to elaborate a bit further on this point, that for our research purposes, we focus primarily on manuscripts where we expect a larger number of prayers. And, if we find a prayer here and there, that is good. But again, what we're looking for are prayers said by the priest in an euphologion context. We are continuing to collect, and that is, I think, something that Elisabeth Schiffer mentioned, and you might want to talk about this a bit more, Elisabeth. We are collecting evidence for high-level intellectuals, of whom there were many, who were also creating prayer texts as a way of showing their literary skills. But we don't collect that systematically. We just sort of put it all in one file as we come across this kind of evidence, and hope that eventually this file will grow. That to us seems to be the most effective way of gathering information rather than searching for it in individual authors. Elisabeth, would you like to elaborate?
Yes, we collect also these prayers. We do not search for them. We come across them and we collect them, and we will concentrate and focus on them in a later stage, I think. But as the individual prayers that can be found in Pinakes, we try to keep record and so that we have all the material gathered.
Okay. And we have one more question from anonymous attendee. Are there any differences between monastic and non-monastic euphologia, if there are such categories? Also, did lay people own their own euphologia, use them on their own? Do we have evidence for such a use? Elias, Elisabeth, you want to speak to that?
Yeah. So monastic euphologia were euphologia that were primarily used within the monastic community. So what features most heavily are prayers or akoluthia for tonsure and things like that. Whereas primarily, but not only, but whereas non-monastic euphologia were euphologia that were used by priests in several lake communities. So it is there where we find prayers for the blessing of fishing nets or for harvesting and so on.
Irini, there are exceptions, right? Do you need to unmute yourself?
Yes. Yes. There are regarding. Sometimes we do have monastic ecologia, including, for example, prayers related to birth and childbed. So, but this is something that that we will discuss maybe after my presentation.
Okay. Yes, thank you. I think that is a good moment. We're also right on schedule with this. I'm just checking. There are no more questions that I can see. So we're moving into the second part of the presentation. I will start sharing my screen again and hand the microphone over to Irini Afentoulidou. Here we go.
Yes, thank you, Claudia. So I'm going to talk about prayers on birth and childbed. Childbed meaning the period of time beginning with childbirth, which is a time of danger for mother and child, especially in times and spaces of limited access to health care and adequate nutrition. It is also a time associated with taboos and rituals in many cultures. In Byzantine Christianity, this liminal period lasted 40 days. So in the following, I'll present the prayers transmitted in the Evchologion that are related to birth and childbed. I will present them in the chronological order of their first appearance, because the topics included change over time. We have an expansion of concerns addressed. So one of the earliest childbed prayers, which is the first item in your list, yes, you see the arrow, thank you. This is the prayer for the 8th day after birth, in which the child is sealed, that is, the priest blesses the child by making the sign of the cross with his hands. And at this rite, the child is given a name. This prayer is said at the threshold of the church. The baby is not brought into the church until the 40th day, which brings us to the next item. The earliest extant Evchologia transmits also one prayer for the churching of the child on the 40th day. That is, when the child is brought into the church for the first time. The churching of the child marks the end of this period of childbed. So in these two prayers, in this prayer for these two concerns, said on the 8th and the 40th days, the main concern is the initiation into the Christian church in anticipation of the full inclusion through baptism. From the 10th century onwards, this is the third item in your list, we have the first prayers for the churching of the woman. That is, when a woman first goes into the church on the 40th day after she has given birth. According to Byzantine canon law, church law, a woman was considered ritually impure for 40 days after birth, and also for 7 days from beginning of menstruation. She was not allowed to enter the church or receive sacraments unless she was at the point of death. The churching of the woman on the 40th day marked the end of this liminal period. The only concern in the prayers said for the woman on the 40th day is ritual purity. In the first few centuries, the Evchologion did not address other concerns related to birth and childbed, such as the health of the mother and the child, the protection from attacks by the evil spirits, or the well-being of the entire household. These concerns were left out of the scope of the Evchologion in these prayers. Yet, such concerns were among the most common ones addressed in the ritual practices outside the Evchologion, hanging amulets, for example, or saying adjurations, praying to saints, etc. Next slide, please. So in the slide, you see two amulets used to protect women and newborn babies. They depict, among other, Saint Sicinius riding on his horse and attacking the female demon Gilu who was believed to kill newborn babies. We have several texts transmitted in non-liturgical manuscripts with adjuration against the demon Kilu, and here you see amulets addressing this topic. So the next slide, please. So in the prayers in the first centuries of in the earliest Epologia, we do not have such concerns, but from the 15th century, Epologia include prayers for the woman who has given birth to be said at home on the day of birth. And from the 15th century, we have also further prayers for further birth-related issues, prayers for the midwives, or in general, the women who assisted the birth, and prayers for the woman who has had a miscarriage. One remarkable thing about these new prayers from the 15th century onwards is the shift from the church towards the private household. The early prayers for the 8th and the 40th day were said at the threshold of the church or inside the church. The new prayers are said in the house in which the baby was born. One can notice a shift also as regards the concerns of childbed prayers. In the new prayers said at home, new concerns are addressed for the first time. So it is only the prayers for the day of birth that health and well-being of the woman and the child are addressed. Also, the household of the woman and the child is only mentioned in some prayers, first attested in the 15th century. And also the prayers for the midwives testify to a renewed interest in the network of the lay community. Now I'll show you an example of a prayer for the day of birth. Next slide, please. I will read it out since we still have a few minutes left. Lord our God, this is the address, so it's the typical beginning of a prayer addressing God, who was born from the Holy Theotokos, the ever Virgin Mary, and was laid on the manger as a child and appeared as an infant. This part is the anamnesis, which recalls a biblical event. And then it continues with the concerns of the present prayer. Have mercy upon the servant of yours, so-and-so, who gave birth today. Forgive her deliberate and non-deliberate sins, and guard her from every contrivance of the devil. Preserve the child born from her from every sorcery, from every hardship, from every distress coming from the opponent, that is, the devil, from evil spirits of the day and the night. Preserve her under your mighty hand and grant her quick recovery. Purify her pollution. Heal the pains. Grant, lover of humans, strength to her body and soul. Guard her by your bright angels and preserve her from every attack of the invisible opponents. Yes, Lord, guard her from illness and weakness, from envy and the evil eye, and have mercy upon her and the child according to your great mercy. Purify her from the bodily pollution and from the various internal troubles. Lead her out of danger by your quick mercy, demonstrated in her humble body, and raise her, and make the child gestated by her worthy to worship you in the church which you prepared, so that your name is praised. This is the part, the epiclesis, the supplication part, and the prayer, like all typical Epologian prayers, concludes with the doxology. For to you is your glory, honor, and worship, to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit, now and ever, and unto the ages of ages. Amen. So this prayer addresses in passing the topic of ritual purity and pollution, but the main concerns are health and healing and protection from evil spirits. And in this prayer, we have one of the rare mentions of the evil eye in the liturgical book, which is the first mention of the evil eye in the liturgy, in the Epologian altogether. What is absent in these prayers is any mention of concerns such as a difficulty to conceive, a difficult labor, a risky pregnancy, or lactation problems. These were among the most common concerns found in other sources, for example, in collections of saints' miracles or in magical texts. In collections of miracles, for example, one of the most common patterns is that the woman has tried to conceive and then in vain, and then she prays to the saint, and then after a while she gets pregnant. Or we have amulets and incantations for women who have a difficult birth. And this shows the limitations of using the Phologion as a source for social history. And this was mentioned in the discussion before, to extend the Phologion, the topics addressed in the Phologion reflect the concerns, the practices and the concerns of the Byzantine Christians. The Phologion does not cover the whole spectrum of what concerns the Byzantine women, men, and children, but it offers instead insights into the Church's discourse on selected topics. And with this, I conclude my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And we now pass on to Daniel Galatze.
Yeah, so thank you very much. We've heard a lot about the way people lived and rights from birth or education, things like that. Well, there's also concerns about how they died or what people did when someone died. And if there's one thing that's certain, it's that everyone dies. So there are prayers for birth that might not apply to men, and prayers for presbyteral ordination that did not apply to women at that time. Monastic tonsure or imperial coronation would not have been relevant to large parts of society, and nor would agricultural prayers for those who lived in cities. But prayers for death and burial would apply to everyone. Rich or poor, king or beggar, woman or man, layperson or monk. As you can see in the slide here, this icon of the Dormition of St. Sabas from the Benaki Museum. So in early Christianity, although the church was no more involved in developing rituals for death and burial than it was, for example, for marriage, already from the 2nd century, it's clear that prayer for the dead and its form, whether it took place at the tomb or at the altar during the Eucharist, was a major concern of the church. We know that intercessions and prayers for the dead were said during the Divine Liturgy from at least the 4th century onward in diptychs of the anaphora or the central Eucharistic prayer. And from about the same time, we get details about funeral rites and prayers for the dead from the apostolic constitutions or the ecclesiastical hierarchy of Pseudo-Dionysius the Areopagite. Hagiographic texts such as the life of Macrina and the life of Mary of Egypt mention funeral prayers, but do not provide texts. And both the life of Macrina by her brother Gregory of Nyssa and the description of the funeral of Monica by her son Augustine in his Confessions provide extensive details of mourning and rites at the burial, the latter also including a reference to a Eucharist. So in the next slide, we see one prayer for the dead for which we do have the text of from at least the end of the 6th century onward. And it's the prayer whose incipit is, in English, O God of spirits and all flesh, O Theos ton pneumaton ke passis sarkos, and which I'd like to talk about a little today. This is one of the oldest known Greek prayers for the dead that is still used in the Byzantine Rite today. And the prayer is preserved on papyrus fragments and in epigraphy, which you can see on the screen here. The earliest extant witness of this prayer is known through a papyrus fragment from the Negev, Nesana Papyrus 96, dated to around the year 600. And the other inscriptions here are from 11th century funerary inscriptions, mostly from Nubia. The prayer text, however, is likely older than this fragment, and its geographical dispersion is quite vast. Nesana Papyrus comes from the Negev, located halfway between Sinai and Jerusalem, but there are also numerous inscriptions of the whole prayer on stone from Nubia, as seen here, dated between the year 858 and 1243. The prayer in the inscriptions can also include the names of the dead and even their age in the text of the prayer, so it helps with dating the material. The papyrus fragment is generic, so without specific names for the dead. So the next slide, we see that apart from the Nasana papyrus and epigraphical evidence, the prayers found in the oldest extant Greek Evchologion, Barberini Greek 336, about which we've already heard, and an image we've already seen. So this prayer has 4 parts, just like we heard about this prayer that Dr. Afentulidu read. And the first part, the address, God of spirits and all flesh, is the title by which Moses and Aaron call God during the revolt in the time of the sojourn in Kadesh, recounted in Numbers 16 and 27. And it's a sign of repentance in the face of disobedience and the impending punishment of death. In the second part, the anamnetic section summarizes the Christian message of Christ's death and resurrection as victory over human death. In the third part, which is the epicletic part of the prayer, it focuses on the repose of the soul and forgiveness of sins. Nevertheless, a quotation from Isaiah's prophecy of God's coming, which brings healing to infirm human bodies and restoration to barren land, gives the place of the soul's repose a material quality, transformed with new life. The concluding quotation of the epicletic part from Psalm 118, according to the Septuagint numbering, is from a psalm widely used in funeral rites both in Judaism and Christianity. The concluding doxology, the number 4, begins with a quotation of Jesus's words to Martha when he learns of the death of Lazarus and asks if she believes her brother will rise again, John 11:25, before Jesus raises him from the dead. So the 4th slide, as I mentioned, the prayer has a wide geographic distribution and is also attested to in manuscripts of the Ethiopian and Armenian traditions, as well as in early Slavonic translations. The prayer is found in other Evchologia manuscripts, such as the 10th century codices in St. Petersburg at the Russian National Library, Greek 226, or in Grotta Ferrata, Gamma Vita 4 or Gamma Vita 7, and in the 11th century manuscript, the Paris Qualen 213 manuscript that Dr. Schiffer talked about. So from the 10th or 11th century onward, we also learn about the complete office or ritual, in Greek akoulouthia, for the full funeral rite, including the performance of the prayer, O God of spirits and all flesh. The funeral rite had various elements. An initial blessing, Psalm 90 was recited, again, according to the Septuagint numbering, followed by a litany petitions and this prayer, O God of spirits and all flesh, which was also repeated again later in the service, as well as Alleluia, hymns, hymnographic canons, kontakia, and stichira. Ironically, despite the earliest attestation of the prayer, O God of spirits and all flesh, on the papyrus fragment from Nisana in the region of Jerusalem, the ancient Jerusalem liturgical tradition, as we know it in its Georgian manuscripts and translations, does not provide any witnesses of this prayer. So there is an older Evchologion from Sinai Greek, New Finds 53, that does have the incipit of it in the last folios, but in the Georgian sources from Jerusalem, it's not present. So we certainly know of the detailed funeral rites of Jerusalem and the Lavra of St. Sabas in the 10th and 11th centuries. What is still uncertain is why they did not pray this prayer, which is so widely diffused geographically, linguistically, and ritually. And so this question remains to be answered, hopefully with more research from the Evchologia project. So thank you.
Thank you very much to both Irenea Fentulido and Daniel Galazza. And this is the moment where we invite more of your questions and comments and look forward to conversations. So there's a question from our project member Renate Burri. Did the Palamite controversy, whose outcome had an impact on Orthodox dogma, also have an impact on occasional prayers? Whoa. Any volunteers to answer that? It's a good question. Yes, Daniel, please.
I don't know. That's a very good question. The Palamite controversy is coming later than most prayer texts are being composed generally. So maybe one can find something in some prayers, not that I'm familiar with, but if we look at hymnography, which is a completely other genre, one can see that there is not such a clear line of following, let's say, Palamite views in theology in the hymnography, and you find a diversity of texts that sometimes even might imply contradiction to Palamite views on, let's say, contemplation. But with regard to prayers, no answer comes to mind right away. So sorry about that, Renate.
Yes, Irini.
If I have not seen any connection between the Palamite controversy, either, at least in the occasional prayers. Maybe one should look at the monastic services for maybe there one could find something there. If there is a more general phenomenon that I would connect with developments in the Phologion, it would be the sacralization of everyday life or of secular life, or the expansion of the responsibilities or the authorities of the Byzantine Church in the realm of private life, or, for example, the consolidation or the increased importance of a church marriage from the Middle Byzantine period onwards. So this is the only non-liturgical phenomenon that I think that I have been able to see some connection with developments in the Phologion.
I think maybe this is also the moment to emphasize that the prayers in the Eulogion are pronounced by a priest who usually uses the third person. So the third person plural. So these are we prayers. The priest gives voice to the concerns of the community. And these are prayers for a specific purpose. So these are not prayers of contemplation or private meditation, which is something that you might expect more, especially in conjunction with hesychasm and the Jesus prayer, in different kinds of circles, different kind of purposes. So in our work, we usually talk about third person prayers and pay very close attention to the rhetorical form about, who lends his voice to whom and, who prays in the third person for a larger congregation. So these are prayers asking for a particular outcome, collective intercessory prayers, if you like, but these are not prayers of private contemplation. And I think that's a very important distinction to make. Now, Elias has dropped off. I hope that's not because of the thunderstorm that is raging in his background. But in the meantime, we have a question that we can address to Irini Afentulido. Is there any direct phrase in the prayers in which it constructs the connection between the women and fertility?
No. There is no phrase establishing this connection, and it is also remarkable that no aspect of the biological process of pregnancy and birth, and also no aspect of the future tasks of raising the child is addressed in these prayers. The prayers for the woman concerned and the child concerned mainly at first their participation into the liturgical life of the church, and then the later prayers health and healing, but motherhood or any aspect of motherhood is absent in these prayers.
Mm-hmm. Fertility, of course, turns up in the wedding ritual as, you know, the purpose of bearing children, as the purpose of marriage. But maybe this is the moment, Irini, when you can talk more about the gendered aspects of the churching of children, the churching of infants.
Yes, this is an issue that is quite often discussed in church, in pastoral theological discussions lately. Well, we have some evidence that there was a gendered distinction in how male and female babies were churched. In current practice, there is a gendered distinction, but the question is how when we can trace it back. So the sources for the performance of the churching are the marginal instructions in the Phologia, and these are very scarce in the earliest Phologia, but from the 13th, 15th centuries, they become more and more loquacious. So we have some instructions saying that babies of all genders are introduced into the church, but male babies are brought into the altar space, or female babies are not brought into the altar space according to some Phologia. In other Phologia, we have different instructions which still keep a gender distinction. Male babies are brought around the altar table, but female babies are brought only to the third side of the altar table, but not to the front side of the table. So yes, there were more and more evidence. We have more and more evidence for a gender distinction, which is not unanimous. So the idea was rather to introduce a gender hierarchy from the first time that the baby is introduced into the church. And the details of how this gendered hierarchy was expressed varied. I don't know, maybe from I have not been able yet to establish a geographical or chronological distinctions between in the details of the churching. But yes, the idea is that whatever the details, a gender distinction was there.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
It's documented.
And of course, regarding the question of fertility, it could be interesting to elaborate a bit more on the prayers after miscarriage, because miscarriage can be voluntary or involuntary. And you gave us a glimpse of these prayers that existed, but maybe you can talk a bit more about that.
Yes, this is an interesting topic, because one of the prayers for the occasion of a miscarriage, in fact, addresses this issue in passing. It mentions the woman who has had a miscarriage, and then with the addition, involuntarily or not. And then it goes on with defining the miscarriage as the killing, voluntary or involuntary. Well, compared to canon, if we look at the canonical text, there was a distinction between spontaneous miscarriage, miscarriage brought about by what medical ideas and common opinion considered as a responsibility of the woman, and abortion. So this prayer addresses this legal distinction between voluntary and involuntary miscarriage. There have been a lot of discussions about this issue lately. So there was a brilliant article by Nina Glibetic where she examined medical theories on the causes of miscarriage, and it was well, common medical knowledge that miscarriage was mostly the fault of lifestyle choices or circumstances of the woman.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. And I think the next question is for Daniel Galazza. How often do Ephiologia describe funeral rituals, the specific actions like washing and clothing of the body, taking a deceased into a church, and so on? And could you perhaps tell us a bit more on the contents of the office for the dead?
Yeah, thank you. So the Ephiologia themselves quite often contain at least a prayer for the dead, and most commonly it's this one, O Theos ton pneumaton, that I spoke about. But there's a variety of various prayers. For example, the Barberini Ephiologion has individual prayers for this generic one, and then some for specific cases for monks, for bishops, and the content of the prayers is addressed to their kind of life situation, so to speak. With regard to the specific rites of funerals, very often in the earliest sources, the details of the Ephiologion are quite sparse. So what they'll have is just a title and then the text of a prayer. And it's, as I mentioned, only from the 10th and 11th century that we have a kind of something that's called a rite for funerals. And even there, the Greek sources focus more on the liturgical texts and give rubrics for the ritual actions in the church, but not so much about domestic rituals. But the Georgian sources are quite interesting. This is not beyond the scope of the Ephiologian project at the moment, but for comparative purposes, it's interesting that Georgian sources that are contemporaneous do mention unique prayers at the cemetery or at the home that are not found in the contemporaneous Greek sources. So, and then they'll give rubrics, although again, minimal, about the fact that these actions do take place, whether it's washing the body or praying at the home of the deceased or processing the body or even digging the grave. So that's why kind of in a future iteration of the Ephiologian project or in future research, it's important to take into consideration the other languages that exist. But as time goes on, then later sources give more details. But again, the Ephiologion itself in the early sources is intended for the presider, who would probably not be concerned with carrying out these rituals. So it's more the prayer texts that are there. But with regard to the rite itself, very often when there's hymnography involved, it follows a structure that is kind of a fusion of like a monastic morning service or matins and a cathedral stational liturgy with proper concerns for the deceased. So,
Thank you. Can I follow up with a question to you, Daniel? I was quite struck by finding prayers on inscriptions, and especially a prayer of that length. And it's even more striking that these should be found in the peripheries of Orthodox Byzantium, in Nubia. Can you elaborate more on that?
Well, about Nubian liturgy, I would direct everyone to the work of Professor Heinz-Gert Brackmann. That's even on the periphery of my knowledge, but it's quite widespread, and there's a lot of I think in fact, Polish scholars, because of the connections with archaeological digs that are finding material there and are investigating these connections. But with regard to the fact that in finding prayers inscribed on the stones, funeral stones, I was also struck by that and wondering perhaps if it could be that an absence of this prayer in written form in an evchologion could be supplemented by having the text in front of you on a tombstone and then you read it from there, or it's something that is known by people and recited privately. Perhaps, I'm not sure. We talked about how the evchologion is the prayer book of the presider, or the prayers are intended for the priest, but when you have the same prayer that's intended to be recited by a priest on a tombstone that's accessible to everyone, passerbys, I'm not, something for further research to investigate if these prayers were recited, in fact, by the laity or non-ordained in the context of praying for the dead. So
interesting. And that would assume that there would be a lot of Greek read and people would be able to understand and read the Greek.
Well, understanding, that's an open question, I think, because Greek does continue as a liturgical language, considered kind of maybe like a sacred language in the Eastern Mediterranean, beyond areas where Greek would have been spoken. So even where something like Syriac or Christian Palestinian Aramaic or Arabic becomes the dominant language, Greek continues on as the liturgical language for quite some time, 13th century in the Syriac context and beyond. So.
Yep, thank you. Looking if there's more questions, comments, queries. Elias Nesseris is back. So the question that we all that is usually put to us, and it's been implicit in some of what has been said, is to what degree can we expect these prayers to have been used in exactly this form? And it's a question that we've been pondering since the beginning. It's a question that is made more difficult by the fact that Elias Nesseris has already drawn attention to, which is that sometimes you have the same prayer concern addressed with multiple prayer texts, even within the same manuscript. And of course, across different manuscripts and across the centuries, you might find more prayer texts for the same prayer concern. That for us then raises the question of, what are all these prayer texts doing? One answer may be, and that has been suggested by Gabriel Radel, and it's something that I can certainly confirm from my work on Byzantine adephopiesis, the ritual of brother making, is that very often when you have multiple prayers for the same concern in the same manuscript, you have the first prayers that is titled Prayer for this and this purpose. And then the second, and sometimes there are more than two, so the subsequent prayers appear with the title Efhi Ali, another prayer with reference to the primary prayer that actually has the label. And certainly in the later traditions, so in the manuscripts of the 14th, 15th century, you have the first prayer, which is very common. It occurs through most manuscripts, and a second prayer similarly common attested in manuscripts in the 8th and 9th centuries. And then the Efhi Ali often appears in only one single instance in a late manuscript. And the fact that it only appears in one single instance seems to indicate that this was a prayer perhaps created by a liturgist for a particular occasion. It is often based on individual snippets of prayer text. It sort of picks up on the biblical reminiscences from the original baseline prayer, but represents a variation on that, which was considered worth writing down, either for purposes of archiving or for future reference. And so one possible interpretation is to say that the appearance of this second prayer, especially in later manuscripts, certainly shows that the prayer concern is one that remains active. So ritual brotherhood continued to be performed and you continued to need prayers for this. And it shows that there is a lively tradition of new prayers being composed. I remind you of what we saw at the beginning, the prayers of the priest in the Mani blessing the salt harvest. That is a prayer text that reads, it was published along with this image 2 years ago in an Orthodox Church journal. And the prayer reads like a medieval one for good reason, because it takes bits of earlier prayers and earlier invocations and biblical reminiscences and puts them all together into a whole. So what is clear is that we cannot date texts. We cannot date prayers based on their words. The only way we can date is on the basis of first appearance in manuscripts. And that's why our manuscript work is so important as providing us with any kind of chronological framework for what's going on. And the prayer texts, the prayer concerns themselves give us some kind of guidance. Irini Afentolidi used the word discourse to understand what people's interests were, what people's needs were, and certainly the traces of use that Elias Neseris draw attention to show us the particular passages within a manuscript where that were particularly well worn from thumbing through. For example, you have darkening along the edges where the priests use the manuscripts most frequently, and we pay detailed attention to that. And it's interesting that we then also have these prayers that occur in the regular commemoration cycles, like the ones that Elisabeth Schiffer mentioned, which show us that there is some kind of repetition and regularity, not only in the church year, but also in the calendrical year when it comes to using these prayers. Now I'm looking at people on the screen. Do you have questions, comments, things that need to be said? If not, then maybe, Yamur, what do you think?
If not, we can conclude right now, if it is available for you, Professor Rapp. And thank you so much for this really great, impressive talk.
Well, thank you for giving us this chance, and we invite everybody who has listened to visit our website, and we thank all the participants for their questions and comments.
I also would like to thank our attendees too for joining us today. Please also do not forget to follow us throughout the ANAMED's website and also our social media accounts. Good evening. Thank you so much again.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.